This is our teaching video for Sunday, June 9th, the third Sunday after Pentecost, entitled Signs, Wonders, and Widows. You'll notice my voice is a little raspy. Had a cold this week. I'll try not to hack and cough into the mic, but otherwise we should be good to go. If you want to do some preliminary reading before coming on Sunday, you can go to the book of 1 Kings, chapter 17, verses 17 through 24. And actually, if you want, you can also read verses 1 through 16. Also in the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. And then if you really feel like you're on a roll and you want to get the full content even above what you'll hear on Sunday, you can actually also go to 1 Timothy chapter 5, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. Alright, if you take time to read those stories, what you'll find is that we have two stories of widows whose only sons die and then are miraculously brought back to life, one by the prophet Elijah in 1 Kings, and the second by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. That story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath is very famous, and the city of Zarephath, or more the village of Zarephath, is up here on the Mediterranean coast, north of Tyre near Sidon. And actually you'll notice, if you look in this map down here, it's outside of the land of God's people. And so the widow of Zarephath becomes an instance of someone who is faithful even outside of God's own. And so as Peter will remark several times in the scriptures, I am reminded once again, God does not show the impartial hand, actually having to reach outside of the people to find someone who will care for the prophet Elijah in a time of lack. Now the village of Nain is back in the land of God's people, and you see it down here just to the southwest of Mount Tabor. If you remember, Mount Tabor is the mountain of Transfiguration. Nazareth is up here, and then you see the very familiar Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, Gennesaret, Magdala, Tiberias, and so on. So this is the village where Jesus goes and raises the young man from the dead. See, just what you need is for Java to interrupt, raising the man from the dead and returning him to his mother. Well, in talking about these two resurrection stories, or maybe we should say these two resuscitation stories, or revival stories, we want to lift up the issue of miracles and what those are about. But we also want to talk about widows, and this is where we'll actually end up talking about 1 Timothy 5 at the end of the presentation. Now, in our own time, signs and wonders and miracles seem to belong to another age. And in fact, what I've pulled up for you on the screen is the title cover of what's been called now the Jefferson Bible, what Thomas Jefferson called the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted textually from the Gospels. And Thomas Jefferson meant literally extracted. He took a razor blade and cut up the Gospels and re-glued them together to try and develop a life philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth. And what that meant in practical terms is many of Jesus' teachings, like Sermon on the Mount, were included, but no stories of miracles like the story of Nain would have ended up on the cutting floor of Monticello. And it's a sign of miracles being seen as something superstitious or belonging to a less rational age. And sometimes we have the sense, too, that miracles are something that happened before us. But what I want to present to you is that life in the Spirit means that signs and wonders are still part of the story, but they are not the only part of the story, and they're not the most important part of the story. But I do want to say that signs and wonders, miracles like what we see in 1 Kings and Luke, are still with us in the church because the Holy Spirit is still with us. But like I said, even when they appear, they are not the most important, but rather they point beyond themselves to what is ultimate. If you want to think about it this way, the miracle that we read about in 1 Kings and the miracle that we read about in Luke, or these two miracles, are really signposts that point beyond themselves. So they don't want to just point to themselves, they point beyond themselves. And in fact, what we might say is, using the word we used last Sunday, these miracles are meant simply to confirm. Or if you want to use like FedEx or UPS talk, miracles are simply the confirmation number that God provides. And what is being confirmed here? What's being confirmed isn't necessarily that a package is being delivered, but what's being confirmed is that the word that is spoken is reliable, or the word that is spoken is true. You'll notice if you read that first King's story, when the widow talks to Elijah, the death of her son is very confusing. So at first she imagines that Elijah has come to punish her, and perhaps the child was born somewhat scandalously. But when Elijah delivers the child to her, notice what she says in verse 24. She says, "I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true." So this is the word is true. This is what the miracle is for, to confirm what is being spoken. And you have to remember, Elijah is not a popular prophet. He is on the run, and will remain on the run, because he really represents the minority opinion as it relates to religion and politics, and that can be a very dangerous place to be. And so this raising of the son is seen as a confirmation of the word. And you'll notice the miracles of Jesus are never meant as ends to themselves, but rather they're always pointing back to Jesus, who is who he says he is. Namely, the testimony about Jesus is true, the Son of God among us to redeem the people of God. Now, the fact that these miracles are done aren't just confirmation of the testimony, but they also uncover the meaning of the message. So the miracle itself points beyond itself, but it also uncovers the meaning of the message. And in this case, you'll notice the message is the dead will rise and relationship will be restored. And I think this is a lovely element in both stories, that the son in the first lesson and the son in the second lesson are given to their mothers, respectively. So it says, Elijah came down from the upper room and gave the boy to his mother. And then Jesus says, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The young man sat up, and Jesus gave him to his mother. I mean, this is also a nice antidote when the woman accuses Elijah that God's in the business of punishing people and taking children away through death. No, the message and the miracle are connected. God is not interested in visiting death upon anyone, but rather raising the dead and also then having relationship restored. And anyone who's grieved or anyone who's gone through that grieving process knows the deep desire in the heart. If only they would walk through the door. If only I could see the person one more time. And indeed, this deep desire of the heart is something that God will fulfill. And these signs are really a foreshadowing of something universal. So they're individual stories, but they point finally to something universal. That this raising of the dead by God will be something that everyone experiences eventually. Now I want to kind of tie two things together, which is miracles and widows. The first thing I want to say is that this story of the widow in Zarephath and the story of the widow at Nain are pointing to the testimony about Jesus, but we know there are plenty of people who go to the funeral and the body ends up in the ground. So yes, miracles are still present in the spirit, but what happens when the miracle doesn't happen to you? So we might put it this way, when it doesn't happen. Especially when we encounter a death, when that space is opened up in our life, what does that mean for us? What are we meant to do? And especially when it comes to relationships broken by death, when that death happens, what is to fill that space? And that's an important question. And now let me tie that to widowhood. Now, of course, in the Bible, and really sociologically, the widows that we're talking about, all they have are their sons. If they didn't have any children, they have no means to support themselves. They have no security. So in both cases, we have widowhood being equal with vulnerability. So it's not like they're getting a social security check or they have some sort of social net or welfare. No, in this case your family was your social net. Your family is what gave you stability. And in this case, the widow without a son has experienced a particularly bitter loss. Because not only is it a relationship that has been broken by death, but now a whole social network or a whole social net has dissolved. So we really have to understand that when the child is restored to the mother, when Elijah gives the son, when Jesus gives the Son, he's also offering a fuller life of safety and peace. And so this gift of resurrection is really a whole cloth gift that comes with many gifts alongside. I want to end with a little tour to 1 Timothy chapter 5, and you'll see really starting in verse 3 and moving to 15. And we're not going to spend too long on this, but what I want you to notice is that in the early church, widowhood often became an office. It was almost like an official office that a person could have in the community and with particular responsibilities. And there was a connection between widowhood and a particular kind of virtue. meaning you had to have both. Some widows were not fit for this work, but a widow who was virtuous then had a special role in the church. And what I want you to think about is, if a space in your life opens, how might it be that service of God fills that space? Now, that's a pretty wide possibility of what that could mean. But sometimes we don't imagine that our life could be more and more directed towards God. And especially we get to a certain place in our life where maybe even in the evening of our life we will be most productive in our faith. So now notice here, the apostle makes some distinctions. Like in verse 4, if a widow has children, they should care for her and put the religion into practice by caring for her. So they want to make a distinction already that the widow who will be living in the Christian community and who will be provided for by the Christians, if they have children and grandchildren, let that family unit care. But if the widow is left all alone, and we talked a little bit about this, and she's continually putting her night and day into prayer, then let her who is virtuous be the widow that we consider. And you'll notice, compared to her in the next verse, is the widow who is unvirtuous. The widow who lives for passion is dead even while she lives. One of the reasons I want to bring this up to you is you'll see the early Christians really struggling with how is it that our faith shapes community? How is it that our faith shapes relationships and obligations that we have to one another? And as we talk about widows today, I thought it would just be interesting for us to look at this because it actually played into the church and what it taught in the early centuries of the movement. Now, if you look down here in verse 9, you'll see something called the list of widows, and this is kind of this registry that the church keeps of those who will be officially doing the church's work in their widowhood when this space has opened up to serve God through prayer and service. And so you'll notice there's an age requirement, that you have to be over 60 and that you were faithful in your marriage. And then also notice there's kind of a list of that you were known for good deeds, how you brought up your kids, how you showed hospitality, work you've done in the church. And notice in verse 11, they turn away younger widows, saying don't put them on the list, but let them go and be remarried. And in this case, they talk about sensual desires overcoming a dedication to Christ. And so this is good for us to look at because it's eminently practical advice for the church trying to figure out how do they shape their community, and in this case, Paul writing to Timothy. Now, this is the kind of language written in the Bible that's probably stronger and starker than what we would use, especially if you read ahead. But I want us to consider that when space is opened up in our lives, or when in fact we encounter death, and when a relationship is entrusted to God, or our dead loved one is entrusted to God, sometimes this is an occasion for us to grow in faith and to grow in the work that we do for Christ. And so the idea of widowhood being almost an office in the church is something foreign to us, but you can see how people in their life then direct energy towards the community of faith. And maybe you, as you grow in your age, or you, as you grow in new circumstances, will find a calling or an occasion to serve God more deeply through the church. Well, just to review a little bit, we talked about miracles as signposts. We also talked about the fact that since the Holy Spirit is present with us, miracles are still present with us. Holy Spirit still brings these gifts. These gifts are still present in our life. We talked about widows and the particular vulnerability that they experienced in their culture, but how it was that God restored relationship to them and also brought someone back to life. And so in both cases we had the sons given to the mother. But we also saw in 1 Timothy how the church had to deal with, really in its day-to-day practical life, not what to do with the miracles, but what to do with the people who just experienced life. And so 1 Timothy, we see the early church, and we might even say the earliest church, wrestling with what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus but still experience all of life. Maybe not to have signs and wonders or to have the miraculous, but to be wrestling with daily life, but trusting that indeed the word given to us in Jesus is reliable, and so an entire life can be reshaped in the service of that word. This concludes our teaching video for June the 9th. I'll look forward to seeing you on Sunday.